It was a cloudy Thursday afternoon, and the school day was winding down. Mrs. Sharma, a ninth-grade math teacher, was in the middle of her last class when the principal's voice came over the intercom. "Attention, students and staff. This is a lockdown drill. Please follow the procedure and remain calm." Lockdown drills were common at the school, so no one panicked. Mrs. Sharma instructed the students to move to the back corner of the classroom, away from the windows. She locked the door, turned off the lights, and pulled the blinds down, just as they'd practiced many times before. The room was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of feet. Mrs. Sharma whispered for everyone to stay quiet and still. After a few minutes, Mrs. Sharma noticed something strange. Usually, during a drill, the principal or a security officer would walk through the halls to check if the classrooms were following the procedure. But this time, there were no footsteps, no voices, just an eerie silence. Then came the sound. It started faintly, a slow, deliberate tapping on the window. Mrs. Sharma froze. Her classroom was on the second floor. There was no way someone could be tapping on the window, unless they had climbed up the building. She glanced at the students, who looked equally scared. The tapping stopped, but a shadow moved across the blinds. Mrs. Sharma held her breath, silently praying it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. A few minutes later, the intercom crackled again. This time the principal's voice sounded off. "Attention, the lockdown is now real. Repeat, this is not a drill. Remain in your rooms." Her voice sounded strained, almost as if she was whispering or trying not to cry. The tension in the room skyrocketed. One of the students, a boy named Arjun, whispered, "What's happening, ma'am?" Mrs. Sharma motioned for him to stay quiet. The silence was broken by heavy footsteps in the hallway. They didn't sound like the usual staff or security. These footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. Mrs. Sharma's heart pounded in her chest. The lock held, but whoever was outside began scratching at the door. One of the students, a girl named Mira, started crying softly. Mrs. Sharma gestured for her to stay quiet. The scratching stopped, but the tension remained. The classroom had a small gap at the bottom of the door. Mrs. Sharma saw a pair of feet standing there. They were barefoot, filthy, and covered in what looked like mud or blood. The feet lingered for a few moments before moving away. The students and Mrs. Sharma sat in terrified silence, listening to the footsteps fade down the hallway. Then came the sound of a door slamming somewhere in the distance. After a few minutes, Mrs. Sharma's phone buzzed. It was a text from the school receptionist. "Stay hidden. Don't open the door for anyone. Something is wrong." Mrs. Sharma's hands trembled as she read the message. Who, or what, was in the school? Suddenly, Arjun whispered, "Ma'am, what's that?" He pointed to the air vent near the ceiling. Something was moving inside. The vent cover shifted slightly, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the room. Realizing they couldn't stay, Mrs. Sharma decided to act. She whispered her plan. They would quietly unlock the door and head for the stairwell. She grabbed a metal ruler as a makeshift weapon and motioned for the students to stay close. The hallway was eerily empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. As they reached the stairwell, they heard it, the growl again, louder this time, coming from behind them. Mrs. Sharma urged the students to move faster. They ran down the stairs and toward the exit, but the door was chained shut. Panic set in as the growling grew closer. Just then, the principal appeared, limping and bleeding from her arm. "Follow me," she hissed. She led them to a maintenance tunnel that ran under the school. As they crawled through the narrow space, the growling echoed behind them. The principal stopped at the end of the tunnel and turned to face the group. "Go, I'll hold it off," she said. Mrs. Sharma and the students hesitated, but the principal shouted, "Now!" They scrambled out of the tunnel and into the open air. Police arrived minutes later, responding to multiple distress calls. They searched the school, but found no trace of the principal or the creature. The only evidence was the claw marks on the walls and the chains broken on the main exit. To this day, no one knows what really happened during that lockdown. Some say it was a wild animal, others believe it was something supernatural. The school closed down shortly after, and the building was abandoned. Locals claim they still hear growls and scratching noises coming from the empty halls. Lockdowns are supposed to keep us safe, but what happens when the real danger is already inside? If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, remember, the shadows might be hiding more than you think. It started off like any other Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my second period history class, half listening to Mr. Kent drone on about the Industrial Revolution when the intercom crackled to life. Attention, students and staff. This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Lock your doors and stay away from windows. A hush fell over the room as Mr. Kent immediately went to the door, locking it and flipping the lights off. "All right, everyone," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Move to the corner, stay quiet, and don't touch your phones." That was the rule during drills. No phones. But this didn't feel like a drill. The way Principal Carter's voice shook made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first 15 minutes were uneventful. We huddled in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional whisper from the back of the room. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't dare check it. Then we heard it. At first, it was faint, like someone dragging something heavy down the hallway. A metallic scraping sound. It stopped right outside our door. No one breathed. The doorknob rattled. We stayed frozen as the knob jiggled again, harder this time. Then came a knock, slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other side was toying with us. Mr. Kent held a finger to his lips, signaling for us to stay quiet. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the sound moved away, the scraping growing fainter until it disappeared altogether. "Do you think it's safe?" Emma whispered from beside me. Mr. Kent didn't answer. He just stared at the door, his face pale. About 10 minutes later, a muffled scream echoed from somewhere down the hall. It was distant but unmistakable. Someone else whispered, "That sounded like Miss Taylor." We all looked to Mr. Kent, who was still by the door, his hand on the lock. He turned to us and said, "Stay here. I'll be back." "What? No," I blurted out before I could stop myself. "You can't leave us." But he was already opening the door, slipping out into the hallway before I could say anything else. The door clicked shut, and we were alone. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Mr. Kent didn't come back. The classroom felt like a tomb, the silence pressing down on us. "I can't just sit here," Ethan muttered, standing up. "What are you doing?" Emma hissed. "I'm going to find out what's going on," he said, heading toward the door. Against my better judgment, I followed him. "You're not going alone," I whispered. Emma grabbed my arm. "Are you insane? Just stay here." But I couldn't. Something about the silence outside didn't sit right with me. The hallway was darker than it should have been, the emergency lights casting an eerie red glow. We crept down the hall, passing empty classrooms and scattered books. The silence was suffocating. When we reached the intersection near the library, we stopped. There was something on the floor, a dark smear leading into one of the classrooms. Ethan stepped closer, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't." But it was too late. He pushed the door open and we saw what was inside. Blood. A lot of it. The desks were overturned, papers scattered everywhere. And in the middle of the room was a teacher's body. I couldn't even tell who it was, crumpled like a broken doll. "Holy," Ethan whispered, stumbling back. Before we could process what we were seeing, a sound came from behind us. A low, shuffling noise. We turned and saw a figure at the end of the hall. It was tall and hunched, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. "Run," I whispered. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. We bolted back toward the classroom, the sound of footsteps following us. We made it back, slamming the door shut and locking it. Emma's eyes widened when she saw us. "What happened?" I couldn't answer. My hands were shaking too much. The footsteps stopped outside our door. Then came the knocking again, slow, deliberate. We didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We waited in silence for what felt like hours until the sound of sirens filled the air. Police flooded the building, escorting us out one room at a time. They never told us what happened. But as we walked out, I glanced down the hall where we'd seen the figure. The floor was clean. No blood, no body. Just an empty classroom. Whatever happened that day, no one ever explained it. And no one ever found Mr. Kent. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knocking.